Two topics I wanted to cover today. The first is fan out work. Fan out work is a type of work where a team or a role creates a lot of work throughout the rest of the organization. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the dynamics of this, why it happens, and dig into how to address fan out work and how to make that less of an issue within your organization. A second topic we're going to cover is managing a bottleneck team. Every organization of a certain size has bottleneck teams. And so we're going to go into why these things happen, how to address things like stakeholder bullying, shifting responsibilities, and we'll get into some very concrete advice for how to manage and make a bottleneck team less of a bottleneck. So I wanted to talk today about a topic that I haven't seen anything really written about before, and that is the danger of fan out work. This is something that I've observed mostly in organizations that are medium-sized or larger. And this happens when there are parts of the organization that generate work that gets spread out amongst the entire organization. So, just to frame this a little bit, I'm going to talk first about a couple of examples. Like, what do I mean when I'm talking about fan out work? And what do some examples of this look like? One is platform teams. And this is not to vilify them. They are reasonable people that are doing things that they believe are really good for the company. So these are the type of examples of things I see platform teams engage in. For example, there might be large technical migrations. Like, let's say we're going to move from MySQL to Postgres. And so all the teams that are on MySQL, they need to do this migration. Or there might be a project that is actually like a real project that needs to happen across a lot of different teams, like role-based access control. This is a lot of business reason to do this, but it's the type of project that can affect almost every team in engineering. There are teams that maintain APIs, and they may deprecate an API and not provide an easy migration path. That is generating work for all of their consumers. There are platform teams that have libraries that they offer. And if they don't make it easy to upgrade to the next version of that library, they can create a lot of work for their customers. A lot of times this happens when there's some sort of underlying technology change that requires breaking changes. Essentially, this work gets foisted out upon many, many, many teams. I've seen this happen where 30 teams or 50 teams have to basically do work because there's some sort of incompatibility that's introduced. And I see this happen with other teams or other roles as well. Architects are another source of generated work. You'll see architects that create these plans that represent things that they think need to happen, and yet those plans require work. And so they can often come across like unfunded mandates, or they can introduce slowness across every project. So let's say you mandate a particular new pattern in the code. That means either two things need to happen. Either every time somebody touches it, they need to update it, or somebody needs to go in and do the work to do all of those changes. But this sort of fan out work can happen from a lot of places. Like a natural place for it to happen is from product. Product management is essentially a role that does this by default. And sometimes there can be these big initiatives that can affect a lot of different parts of the organization. And it's not to say that fan out work is in itself a bad thing. It's just that I think there's a lot of costs associated with fan out work that are often not accounted for. So, for example, the architect example, they may mandate a new way of doing things, but if you computed the amount of work it will actually take to move to that new pattern, even if it's better, it's very likely that you would not actually fund a project if it took, you know, 3 months for a single person to do all that work. Would you pay that amount of money to like do that, all that work? Probably not. And so you sometimes the cost of that is hidden. And so some of this other work with like deprecating an API, that's a very inexpensive decision for a team to make for itself, but it's a very expensive decision for it to make for the entire organization because the work is like basically externalized, and externalized costs are often a danger. I've come up with a couple of approaches that I think can be useful for dealing with fan out work as a class of work. One approach is to have the team generating the work do the work. And I've mentioned this in the past in a couple of different places. This generally comes across as a very provocative way of looking at it because it's like, oh, just have the people generating the work do it. I actually think that that provides a good kind of feedback mechanism. It is forcing the cost of things to not be externalized. And so if you're going to be doing a lot of tech migrations, for example, it forces you to fund the teams that can do that work. I've sometimes seen in organizations that are separated between a platform org and a product org, I've actually seen the product org's work be almost completely consumed by platform work at times. And that seems like a bad sign. Like, even though some of that work was very valuable to the business, it it wasn't a decision that I think was made very consciously a lot of the time. Another way you can sometimes avoid fan out work is to make sure that there are some limits to the number of things that can be pushed through the system. So for a platform team, for example, you might say, hey, we have the capacity to do one or two of these sort of big migration projects per year. You have some sort of budget for that. You can also ask people to calculate this expense and do some sort of thinking about what the actual cost is that's incurred. Things that force people to think about these things more logically. It just helps to kind of balance the incentives a little bit. Another thing you can sometimes do is you can decouple the work. This reduces the cost of it somewhat because you allow the local teams to actually make more rational decisions about timing. So in the way you would approach this is you make it a central priority, but you allow teams to integrate that central priority into their own roadmaps on their own time scale. This doesn't allow you to have a lockstep of a delivery pattern, but it does allow you to deliver things in a way that kind of harms the organization less because people are able to make better local decisions. So those are some thoughts on fan out work. I'd be really curious to hear if you have any additional experiences or thoughts you'd like to share. I also wanted to talk about a related topic similar to fan out work, which is the other side of the coin, and that is managing a bottleneck team. Bottleneck teams are teams that basically all of the work is being funneled through. It's like every important project requires some sort of work out of them, or all of the pain gets funneled through them some way. I find that there are usually a couple of these type of teams in any sufficiently large organization. You could actually say that that's just true by definition. The theory of constraints basically says there's always a constraint in your system, and a single constraint, and that by dealing with that and removing that constraint, you make your whole system more efficient. I think that's true. when I've observed organizations, it usually seems like all of the projects have this way of funneling through certain parts of the organization. And these teams are usually really stressful, challenging places to be. When I've talked with these teams, often the situation is pretty dire. Like the people are holding things down. They're often criticized a lot, and their role is not, they're not often appreciated, even though they're often the people that are making the company actually succeed. Everything looks like failure because you can never get enough work out of them. And often they're dealing with so much pressure that their effectiveness is really, really reduced. I have a couple of things that I usually suggest for bottleneck teams. One is that often the underlying issues are actually architectural in nature. And so it's often a really good idea to solicit the help of people that can really think deeply about your team and the situation it's in and how that can be restructured to be better. I think it's really useful to get your stakeholders and your VPs or the important people to kind of understand your situation. One common situation with bottleneck teams is what I call stakeholder bullying. And essentially, this happens when the important people see their success being tied to basically getting you to do this work. And so you'll get these VPs that will basically come by and be like, what do we got to do to make this happen? And they're very persuasive. They're very, they have titles, and it's kind of hard to say no to them sometimes. They also are kind of used to finding ways to get people to say yes. They're going to find deals, or they're going to find ways that they can make it happen. And it can be really like I've seen people in situations where basically that was their problem, that they had all these stakeholders that were basically not willing to say no to them, and they were spending all their time dealing with their stakeholders. Some of the teams that I've seen deal with this most successfully have moved to a self-service model. They were teams that were doing work for other teams. Basically, teams would come to them and they would do something for them. They would code something, they would create APIs, they would make updates, they would do something. And I think to whatever degree you can, self-service is the way to decouple teams. Like if you can make your work products self-service or make it so people can do things themselves, your life is going to be so much better. I've seen a number of great examples of this. One example I'm particularly fond of was a database team that used to provision databases for everybody's services. And they would set up the backup. They would do all of this work for every service in the organization. And when they started off, I don't remember exactly, but it seemed like there was like a week or two lead time just because there were so many people asking things of them, and they had to handle emergencies, and they had to handle all these things. They, over the course of a year, switched their entire approach to being a database as a service. And it totally transformed their team. It basically freed up their team's time to focus on more valuable work and creating a work product that was self-service. Like they were able to continually add new capabilities and solve like ever greater problems. It was a really wonderful example. I've seen that with a lot of things. Self-service isn't just around provisioning. It can be about injecting behavior. There can be a lot of ways you can decouple things so that people can do plugins or other models so that they are in charge of their own logic. They can do the work themselves. Related to that, I've seen teams take on a sort of open source model approach. The team itself isn't doing the work for other people. but they do have some role in vetting the work and curating the work. That can be less work. It doesn't solve all bottleneck problems because sometimes your capacity is still so constrained that you're not able to help out with that. But that's a model I've seen work a couple of times. I've also seen it very useful to preserve focus, usually for a couple of your team members. You can do that sometimes with either a hero role or a cone of silence role. So a hero role is where you take one or two people and you say, you are responsible for all the interruptions to the team. So whenever people ask for question, whenever there are like small bugs, things like that, you are the first line of defense. Take the hit for the team while you're on your rotation. Usually I do those as like weekly rotations and we call them heroes. I've also seen an approach that I call the cone of silence approach. And that is where you protect a couple of your team members from other interruptions to whatever degree you can. And you get them to focus on the kind of work that is going to make your team less of a bottleneck. So this could be the self-service work. It could be some sort of architectural improvements. Generally, you get a small group of people within the team and you just shield them. You can do that with some sort of rotation sometimes. And that one of those approaches can sometimes be a way to preserve focus even when the world is very chaotic. Another thing I've seen work is redefining the team somehow. So you can often shift responsibilities in ways that make sense for the company. For example, I remember once a team that was responsible for all of the scheduled jobs and for the entire engineering organization. They owned probably like 100 different scheduled jobs. And this was just like one of their many responsibilities. What they did is they said, look, it actually doesn't make sense for us to own all of the scheduled jobs because all of the that are different parts of engineering are doing scheduled jobs. What really makes sense is for us to own the infrastructure behind this and the general patterns, and for the teams themselves to own these things. So we're going to get this into a state where that is a possibility. And we're going to set up the monitoring, we're going to set up the code ownership and everything so that that is possible. And we also are not giving you like a huge mess, but we're basically giving you these responsibilities. We're going to be responsible for this. You're going to be responsible for that. I think that sort of like redefinition can often be very successful. You have to be very careful because shifting responsibilities is always very political and it can be a very big challenge. But that's something I've seen work a lot, especially if it's big and structural like that.